Shall we begin with the joke? Moses walks into a psychiatrist's office. He says, "Doc, last night I dreamed I was the tent of meeting." He comes in the next day, says, "Doc, last night I dreamed I was the tabernacle." The doctor says, "Your problem is you're two tents." That's one of those jokes that gets sort of like a rolling laugh as, you know, different people. Oh, tents. Yeah, right. Yeah. It's called Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Old Testament was the term that was started by Christians because they regard as an Old Testament and a New Testament together. Jews are usually not comfortable with the term Old Testament. It sounds like Old Testament, New, Improved Testament. So, and in America, where new means like better, you know, there's questions of supersession and so on. But I've never had a problem with the word old myself because I like antiques, I like retro, so, you know, old is just fine with me. So I'm comfortable with either term. I hope I don't offend anybody with either term. You should do whatever you feel is right and or whatever's consistent with your particular religious beliefs. We'll come to religious beliefs in a second, but first a word about translations. Since I've assigned the one that's by the New JPS translation, that was done in 1973. I do not like it. I do not like any English translations except my own. That's not half as arrogant as it sounds. Well, yeah, it's as arrogant as it sounds, but the classic line is studying the Bible through translations is like kissing through a veil. I mean, it's better than not getting kissed at all, you know, but it lacks that certain je ne sais quoi, you know, that certain soup du jour of having the real experience. And so you can use any translation you want. You just accept that you missed something by doing it in translation. So I hope in the end you'll all learn to do the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew and New Testament in Greek if that's your interest. They're not as hard as people think. They just have different alphabets. That always scares everybody off. You learn the alphabet the first day in class, and then it's not a big deal after that. My personal favorite of the existing English translations is still the King James because it's the most literal and the most beautiful. On the other hand, the King James was done during the reign of King James. It's been a few hundred years since then, and we've learned a lot about Hebrew since then. So there are translations in it that are, there are points that are simply wrong. And I still say, though, it's the most literal and the most beautiful. The problem is that, especially for Americans, reading King James English is all the withers and thithers and whences and thences are really difficult and a put-off. So most people prefer a contemporary English translation. You may know that the King James, that's not even the English of that's Shakespeare's period, right? It's not the English that people spoke or wrote in that period. And when they did the King James translation, they went out of their way to make it sound like an archaic English so it would seem more biblical. So it was even old then when they did it. So there's that problem. Of the more current ones, I liked the Jewish Publication Society one of 1917. So on the basic American principle of if it works, change it, they retranslated it in 1973 and made it worse. But I have assigned the 1973 one because the 1917 one is basically a ripoff of the King James, and it has still a lot of the withers and thithers in it. The same goes for the RSV, the Revised Standard Version. It was a pretty good translation. So they did the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, which to my mind didn't help. And they had the New English Bible. I contributed to that one, and then they did the REB, the Revised English Bible. So every time they get one, they change it, and I don't really care for either of them. A lot of my students have grown up with the NIV and are happy with that, fine. I don't recommend the Good News Bible. I don't recommend the Reader's Digest Abridged Bible. Let's all just stop and think about that for a second. I'm not making this up. There is a Reader's Digest abridged. Think about an abridged Bible as a concept. No, we don't have room for 10 commandments. No, adultery, that'll go. You know, covet, no, and you know, we'll do. I'll go 7. We can go 7. You know, that's how they do that. Some of you may know that in Deuteronomy, twice near the end of the 5 books of Moses, it says what I would consider to be the most violated commandment in the Bible. If I would put that to you, what's the most violated commandment in the Bible? No, it's not the one you all just thought of. It's that one in Deuteronomy, which is, you shall not add and you shall not take away a word of this. And those of you who know your New Testament know at the end of the New Testament also there's a curse on anyone who would add or take away any of it. And when they did the Reader's Digest Abridged Bible, they cut that. It gives the expression, damned if you do, damned if you don't, a whole new meaning, you know? So, it's a useful exercise if you don't want to do, I mean, it's extra work, which is to have in your possession more than one Bible, English Bible, and compare them. And sometimes, you know, there are Bibles that came out that have like 4 different translations in parallel with each other. And it's a very useful thing because you get the sense of how different people are taking it differently. Some go more literal, some go more figurative. My own translation is quite literal. I think it's the closest to getting the feeling for what's going on in the Hebrew. The problem is my translation is not assigned to you. I've only done the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and there are 39. So you need a full Bible for this course. Any questions about Bible translations? Personal beliefs. This is a department of religion. We are in a state university. You can teach religion in a state university. That's fine. Yes, thank you. What you can't do, what I can't do as the teacher, is to favor one religion or take that perspective. If I were teaching at Emory, it's the Candler Divinity School is Methodist, and I could take a Methodist reading of text, and that would be okay. I can't do that here. And I'm guessing that if you're anything like any kind of, you know, cross-section class, there are people in this room who are Protestants, Catholics, Jews, maybe some Muslims. I've had a couple of Zoroastrians, people from Asian religions, people with no religion, people at the atheist end of the spectrum, people from the very pious end of the spectrum. So how do we all come together and study this book, which is not exactly an uncharged subject, this book? And to me, the answer to that is at the level of text, where we can all agree is to try to get the best reading of the text and the best understanding of the world that produced it. And that means text and archaeology. Those are the only 2 things we have to get at what this was until someone comes up with a time machine. Prior to that, you have the text and you have archaeology, and those will be the 2 tools of our course. When I use the text, I use the Hebrew, so I will just translate as I go. Once I forgot to tell a class at the beginning that I was doing that, so since I was reading the Hebrew in my eyes but speaking English to the class and going through, they thought that I was like the clumsiest reader of the Bible they ever heard. They thought I was reading English but with pauses, because I was looking, and so it's Hebrew. But all of you come to this class, every single one of you, with some kind of personal belief or non-belief or anti-belief or whatever. And that's all fine, and I'm happy to talk to all of you about it. I won't talk about my own beliefs in class. They have no part in this class, and I'm not trying to influence anybody to do or not do anything. If you want to find out my personal beliefs, take me out for a drink sometime, and maybe, especially near the end, you might get out of me. But basically, this is my 39th year of teaching in university. I started when I was -4. And I don't believe any student of mine has ever known if I believe in God or not, or in life after death, reward and punishment, unless they got me, you know. I prefer single malt scotch. And as for your personal beliefs, too, if you believe that when you die, your soul goes to the back of a bowling alley in Kentucky, great. I have nothing against anybody's beliefs. They're fine as long as they don't hurt anybody else. But they don't necessarily have a place in this course. They do have a place, though, for discussion, the second we get outside the door. So let's begin. The title of this first lecture is Ancient Near Eastern Religion. So the classic question is, ancient Israel came up with this new form of religion called monotheism, where there's only one God. It wasn't the first monotheism. Some of you know there had briefly been a monotheism that wasn't successful prior to that in Egypt. It's the first lasting monotheism. Now, at the point where ancient Israel begins, which we'll find is around the 12th century BCE, so 3,200 years ago, there had already been civilization on Earth for about 4 millennia prior to that. By civilization, I mean we're not talking cavemen anymore. We are talking about, or cave women. I'm a feminist. That they had people living in cities, composing poetry, doing business with one another, carrying on trade, practicing various religious acts, families, social settings, culture, hatred, war, everything that goes with civilization. There was civilized humankind for thousands of years prior to this. And everybody was fine with pagan religion, thank you. So pagan religion is the most successful religion of all time in terms of duration. It lasted for thousands of years. Christianity is the most successful religion of all time in terms of the number of people there have been, but that's because there's so many more people in the world now. The longest lasting was pagan religion in its various forms. So how is it that this one country, this one little country that's smaller than Georgia, comes up with the idea that there's one God? How does that happen? So the traditional explanation is that the way you get from many to one is a numerical thing, and that it wouldn't just, boom, happen overnight. So it happened as a development over centuries. So the way this is taught probably to this day in most universities around the world is that there were a series of stages. First, there was polytheism. Right, poly in Greek means many, theos means God, so polytheism, belief in many gods. And that as time went on, that moved into a second stage of religion that's called henotheism. You believe in many gods, but one is the chief god. Has possibly the ability to give the power to all the other gods, who is the parent of the other gods. That leads to a third stage, monolatry, which is you believe there are other gods, but you don't care. You just have the one you worship. You're into Zeus, So you worship Zeus. You're not denying that Apollo and all the others are out there, but he's your god. And from this, we arrive at the enlightened heights of monotheism. You really think there's only one. Now, that's very nice. It's logical. You could picture it happening that way. And there's no evidence that it happened that way at all. I don't believe it did happen that way. We will eventually get to what I think happened, and you'll just know the evidence the same as I do. You don't have to accept my answer. You have to understand what the evidence for the whole matter is. But why am I so quick to say that this is wrong? This is a model that was developed in 19th century Europe. And in 19th century Europe, there were a couple of modes of thinking that dominated thinking and formulation of thoughts, especially as seen in universities and seminaries. And those two forces that did that were Darwin and Hegel. Darwin, because he said that things don't change overnight by a process of revolution, but big things in species change gradually through a process of evolution. That is the simplest explanation of Darwin you will ever hear. But it was crucial that it was that essential concept, because what Darwin did became so influential that what he did in the biological realm, they started applying to every realm. So if you were a professor of art in a university, you started talking about the evolution of art. Oh, look, the Egyptians did it this way, where everybody stood straight in the sculptures, and then the Greeks did the S-curve of Praxiteles, and now, you know, you have sculptures with muscles and stuff like that. And this wasn't true, by the way. There had been muscles and beautiful sculptures long before the Greeks and the Mesopotamians, but because we humans are ignorant and think everything begins with the Greeks, we keep forgetting that there was this civilization for 5,000 years while the Greeks were living in caves. So nothing against the Greeks. Some of my best friends are Greeks. And so if you were teaching, you know, literature, you would say writing develops that way. If you were teaching anthropology, you would talk about human civilization develops that way. But everybody was seeing development. That was the key. The most powerful influence of Darwin was in all these areas, not the area that everybody thinks of, which is in the biological realm. And eventually that hit history as well. That we saw human history as developing, not having overnight revolutionary events. And the key person for that was the German philosopher Hegel. And Hegel is famous for this famous formulation of how these things go through development, the famous thesis, antithesis, not antithesis, and synthesis. There is an original idea, or belief, or doctrine, or religious view, or political view, a thesis. And then it comes to be opposed by another, an antithesis that is either the direct opposite of that or at least very different. And then the two do battle, either literally battle, where people are fighting and dying for these things, or figuratively or spiritually or through debating or persuasion, that the two confront each other. But the result of this process is that in the end, neither the thesis nor the antithesis wins, but something new is born out of that. That's a product of the very fact that you went through this process, and that's called synthesis. And that's called the dialectical process. So let's say, for example, when you were a young kid, you were really religious. You went to the church or synagogue or whatever of your family. You really believed in it. You really did good. You did your prayers. You did your observances or rules, whatever of your particular religion. And then when you got older, you went to college. You started having doubts. You questioned things. You decide religion is a crock. You don't want anything to do with it. Your mother cries. You go through a whole change of life. Then in your 40s, you come back to religion and you rethink it. And you start once again doing all the things you did when you were a kid. If someone would walk up to you at that point in your life and say, well, you really blew it for about 20 years there. Now you're back on track. You realize you had it right before. That would be a really stupid thing to say to you. Because that religiosity when you're 40, even if it means all the same practices as when you were 8, is not the same religion as when you were 8, precisely because you went through the process. You challenged it. So even if you're at the same as you were before, it would be in a new, let's say, more sophisticated or more something, in any event, different, a more synthetic version of it. Now, because this mode of thinking was so dominant all through 19th century Europe and especially in Germany, but then it spread to North America as well and into early 20th century, that's how you got that people couldn't imagine getting from here to here without having a lot of theses and antitheses in the middle. You had to have process, you had to have development, you had to have evolution. So that was the first force that made people start seeing it this way. The second was the Bible itself, because the Bible misrepresents pagan religion. The reason we know this is because there has been a revolution in the last 150 to 200 years, but especially during my lifetime and your lifetimes, and that is the archaeological revolution. When in 1948, 47, a goat made the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls, that sort of put archaeology on the map. We were doing it anyway, but then even people who didn't know anything started hearing about that. To this day, people who've never seen a Dead Sea Scroll or a picture of one or knows what a Dead Sea Scroll is or what a scroll is or where the Dead Sea is, people have heard of it. And archaeologically, we got, we'll see actual cases, but Nineveh alone, which was the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire on the Tigris River in what is today Iraq. Why is it the greatest archaeological discovery of all time? Because what would be the best thing an archaeologist could possibly want to get? A library. And there was a library and it had 50,000 tablets in it. And it opened up the whole ancient world to us. And we'll see other cases like that. In the 1920s, when Ugarit was discovered, Ugarit was a Canaanite city in what is now western Syria, a little north of Lebanon. There were thousands of tablets there in a new language we had never known before. It's a Semitic language, so it's related to Hebrew and Aramaic and Arabic, and it's called Ugaritic. That makes it easy to remember. And that opened up the whole world of Canaanite religion to us. The Bible presents pagan religion as being just idol worship, that they have a lot of gods and they're just stones. So for example, I'll give you Psalm 115. It's a good idea, by the way, for you to bring Bibles with you to class. It helps you keep me honest and when I cite it. And that way also I'll be doing my translation. You can look at yours and see where there's differences. You may feel funny walking around the campus with a Bible under your arm because people think, oh, there's some missionary going by, you know. But it's okay. Starting in verse 2 of Psalm 115, it says, "Why should the nations say, 'Where is their God?' when our God is in heaven? Anything he wants, he does. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have a mouth, but they will not speak. They have eyes, but they will not see. They have ears, but they will not hear. They have a nose, but they will not smell. Hands, but they don't feel. Legs, but they don't walk. They don't make a sound in their throats. Let those who make them and all those who trust in them be like them." Now, that's not written by somebody who's crazy about pagan religion. He's presenting pagan religion as the way, I don't know if you were taught, it's what I was taught as a kid in Sunday school, that until ancient Israel came along, the whole world was stupid. They made statues and then believed the statues were God and prayed to them and asked them for stuff. Socrates was stupid. Aristotle was stupid. Now you might say, but look, the Psalms are poetry. They're a book of songs. And it was apparently the hymn book of the temple in ancient Israel. And people would sing these to musical instruments. The music is lost, so we have it only as poetry now. But you can say in music, you can say things figuratively, so maybe they don't actually mean it at such a literal way that we would take it like that. Okay, prose. Prose, we mean things more literally. In the book of 1 Samuel, in 1 Samuel 5, there's a story that the Israelites go into battle and they take the ark with them, the box containing the Ten Commandments in it. And the Philistines defeat them. The Philistines were Greeks who moved across from the Greek islands over to Israel. So if it helps you to picture all of this, here's how we map. This is how you map the ancient Near East or the present Near East. And it explains a lot, which is you distinguish between land and water. So here's the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, Nile River, Red Sea, before it split, Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River. The Near East. Over here to the east are the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, which flow together into what is now called the Persian Gulf. And that is Iraq today. The Philistines came from Greece, which is over here, and from either there or Crete or the Greek islands, and they crossed over and they settled here along the coast in what is one of their 5 cities was called Gaza, and it is the region that is today Gaza, where all the stuff is happening right now. But this also, by the way, can help you understand why Israel then, like Israel now, is disproportionately in the news. For such a little country, I mean, it's on the news more than France. Well, that's fair. It's on the news more than Russia, China, India. I mean, China and India each have 1 billion people. And you go, why is that so disproportionate? You know that thing in real estate, the 3 most important things are location, location, location. This is the spot where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet. Anybody who wanted to go anywhere had to go through there, and they did. Whether it was for conquest, or to carry culture, or for trade, you went through there. And you still do. And I know that airplanes have changed to that somewhat. And I know that now we have North and South America and Australia. I understand that things have changed somewhat. But this essential meeting point of the 3 great continents changed everything. And it's why there's this constant flow of ideas through Israel, which may or may not be part of the reason why monotheism and a lot of other things were born there, like history writing. The first history writing on earth is going to be part of what I'm reading to right now in the book of Samuel, which was written centuries before Herodotus. So when they tell you again that history writing begins with the Greeks, the sentences I'm going to read you were written when Herodotus's great-grandmother wasn't in preschool yet. Is that a visual, a good metaphor? So here's what happens. The Philistines defeat the Israelites, and they capture the ark. And the Philistines took the ark of God, and they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Ashdod was one of these Philistine city-states that's just north of where Gaza is. It's one of those cities actually being shelled a lot now. And the Philistines took the ark of God, and they brought it to the house of Dagon, the temple of Dagon. Dagon was the chief god of the Philistines, and he is grain, wheat. And they took the ark of God and they set it up next to Dagon. And the people of Ashdod got up the next day, and here was Dagon fallen forward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, as if bowing. And they took Dagon and they put him back in his place. And they got up the next morning, and here was Dagon fallen forward before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and the hands of Dagon were cut off by the threshold. Only Dagon, the body, was left to him. Therefore, the priests of Dagon and all who come to the temple of Dagon don't tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Now, what's interesting about that passage is they're talking about a statue of Dagon, and they're calling it Dagon as if it's the god. Now, that is not true. People did not believe that statues were God. Nobody in the ancient Near East believed that. Now, how do we know that? To get that, let's try to get something at the real distinction between pagan religion and the religion of what most of you are aware today of, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. In pagan religion, you relate to everything dynamically, personally. In the 20th century, the philosopher Martin Buber had this idea. It was called I-thou, meaning you should relate to God I-thou, like directly in second person, not I-it, I-him, I-her in third person. And that meant everything. You relate to the power in each object. So if it's the sun, you would want to communicate directly to the sun. If it's the sky, fire, the earth, water, whatever. Even salt. We have from the ancient Near East an incantation to salt, where the person, when he puts his salt on his food, he says, "Oh, salt, who has the power to enhance the flavor of my meat, do enhance the..." He's talking in second person to a salt shaker, or however they scooped their salt. And the salt shaker was a great, one of those life-changing events like refrigeration, and computing, But he wasn't a jerk for doing that. He was relating to the power in the object and communicating with it. And the things with the greatest power, more than salt, the sky, the earth, the sun, fire, death, those things had a special name. When we discovered that library at Nineveh, we found texts in two main languages that were the two dominant languages of the earth longer than any other language was, even though most people have never heard of them. Those were Sumerian and Akkadian. Full disclosure, when I first came as a graduate student to Harvard, I was the winner of the Most Naive Student Ever Admitted to Harvard Award. I met my first professor, Paul Hansen, and he said to me, "So how's your Akkadian?" I had never heard of Akkadian. And he saw the terror in my face, and he said, "It's okay, you can emphasize Ugaritic instead." I had never heard of Ugaritic. But I got there, 9 languages later, I got there, and all of our graduate students, some of whom are sitting in this room, have to do it. Why? Because I did. So in Sumerian, the special word for these big powers, the things, life and death type powers, was a dingir. The sun is a dingir. The sky is a dingir. The sea is a dingir. In Akkadian, it was Ilu. In Canaanite or in Hebrew, it was El. In Greek, it was Theos. I just did that to show off that I still remember the Greek alphabet. In German, Gott. In French, Le Bon Dieu. In English, God. That is, the things with the most power were called gods. There's no word for to believe in any of the ancient Near Eastern languages. Because you didn't believe in the sun. You looked outside and there was the sun. You didn't believe in Dagon. You ate a sandwich and it was made out of Dagon. I know, the sandwich wasn't invented yet, but you have to cut me, So there's no word for to believe. And by the way, in biblical Hebrew, there's no word for to believe. When you see that in your English translations, it's a little misleading. The word in Hebrew means to trust. It means if God says he'll do X, he'll do it, and you can be sure of it. It doesn't mean like, nobody would walk up in the ancient Near East to someone and say, "Do you believe in God?" That didn't happen. Because to them, gods were definitional. They existed. You could see them. All except one, but we'll get to that one. And so when you hear about some ancient Egyptian king referring to himself as a god, Ralph Fiennes in Prince of Egypt. Was it that long ago? I was a consultant on that movie. There's this new Exodus movie out. I wasn't a consultant on that, so I wondered, who is the consultant? Because I know everybody in the field. So I checked. Nobody. They consulted with Joel Osteen. Well, that cleared that up. I hope I don't offend anyone. If not, you can text him and he'll call me and we'll talk in Akkadian. So, when ancient Near Eastern kings claimed that they were gods, they weren't engaging in shallow egotism. They were engaging in profound egotism because they were gods definitionally. The king of Egypt was a Dingur or an Ilu or an El or a Theos because he had power of life and death. All right, so that's stage one. Stage two is that you start to feel that it's not just a power in itself out there, but you want to be able to relate to that power. You want it on your side. If the storm wind is a power, you don't want it to blow down your house. What can you do to make that not happen? And so you come to believe that there is a will, a consciousness, an intention inside these powers. And in different periods, it's different. Remember, I'm summarizing thousands of years of all forms of pagan religion in minutes. But in some cases, you believe that that consciousness is inside the power itself. So the sun is thinking. Or in other periods, in some religions, it's that the god is somewhere else and has that power, and the sun is his particular expression, and it comes out that way. And so, for example, the word for sun and the name of the sun god are the same thing. So in the Canaanite language, it's Shamash, which comes all the way into modern Hebrew. In contemporary Hebrew, it's Shemesh, which is related. And the name of the sun god is Shamash. The word for grain in Canaanite and in Hebrew is Dagon. And the name of the god who represents that is Dagon. So you could say, oh, thank thee, mighty Dagon, who provides wheat for the belly of humankind, and we praise you, and you could do that. Or you could go out in front of a field of grain and say, oh, let's grind some and make some Dagon for lunch. But it made perfect sense. That was completely consistent. So how do you get to know these gods? Each of the gods are known through their particular powers. So for example, in Akkadian, this was the language of the ancient Babylonians and the ancient Assyrians, which were both in what is today Iraq. The chief god was named Anu. And Anu is the sky. And Anu is called Kronos, if you know your Greek mythology. He's called El among the Canaanites. And Anu is the chief god, but he's sexually impotent. And you go, what? Why would you picture your god as being the chief god, but impotent? Because the sky, on the one hand, is the ultimate force. It's what contains everything else, so it's the chief god. But on the other hand, the sky doesn't do anything. The wind does something, the sun does something. But the sky is all potential, not active power. And so how do you describe that? You say it's a god who is the chief god, but he's impotent. Or the god who's the wind is called Enlil. En means Lord, Lil means wind. So his name and what he is are the same, and he's usually the chief executive god. He's the one who, when you want to get something done, You do that. And if you know ancient Near East or present Near East, the wind is the big force. The storm wind is what really matters. Many of the Psalms describe storms. And God is sometimes pictured as coming in a storm, because that's the most powerful force there. In most of the Near East except Egypt. In Egypt, the most powerful force is the sun. And big surprise, in Egypt, the chief god in almost every period is the sun. In the rest of the ancient Near East, the chief god is usually the wind. He's called Enlil in Sumerian. In Canaanite, he's called Baal. In Greece, he's called Zeus. In Rome, he's called Jupiter. But they're all the same god. They're the wind. So if you're a Baal worshiper and you're on vacation in Greece, it's okay to go to a Zeus temple and worship Baal as under the name Zeus there. And we even have an ancient text, Secunyaton, you don't have to memorize that, which goes through all the gods and says, you know, Baal is Zeus, Aphrodite is Ishtar. And they go through all the gods and goddesses, paralleling them and saying, you know, arose by any other name. I made that up myself. Now, how do you describe a universe like that? You describe such a universe through myth. Myth, for the purposes of a course, when you're studying the ancient Near East, means a story about the gods. You need gods in it, or it doesn't count. And when you make up a myth, you're not just making it up with freedom to make up any old story you want. A myth has to reflect the realities of nature, the real forces that you see among the gods. So for example, I've been at UGA for 8 years. Before that, I was at UC San Diego for 30 years. And if you know about San Diego, California, it's the land of eternal 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's always spring there. So they don't know what you people in Georgia, we people, I've learned to say y'all. I'm not up to fixin' yet, but I'm fixin' to. And there, you were there for the first one. I love grits. I love grits. I know it's a two-syllable word here, as is the word Lord. Lord. God. And even the word dog is a two-syllable word here. I'm a dog. I'm a convert. I went to the U of Miami undergraduate. When I was first married, my wife was a gator. And but we both converted, and we're now Orthodox dogs. And I'm now married to a former Longhorn, so I don't know where that figures at all. Here, I almost lost my point. I do that. Here in Georgia and in Northeast United States, they have these things that they don't know about in San Diego. They're called seasons. There's this season called fall, you know, where there's leaves on all the trees and all, and they all start to go away. And then there's this awful season called winter. And I'm still used to explaining it because these San Diego people didn't know about this. You know, my children were teenagers before they saw snow, you know. And in winter, all the green goes away. And everything looks dry and barren, and it's awful. And don't ever go to school in the north. And then comes another season. It's called spring. And it's like a miracle. Right? I mean, flowers grow, and the leaves come back out on the trees, and people run through the park in slow motion, and it's wonderful. Now, how would you describe that in myth? You would say, what is one of the most common myths that you've probably heard from Native American culture, from ancient Near Eastern culture, many cultures, that there is a god or goddess who every year dies and is reborn. They die and they live in the underworld. They don't live in the they reside in the underworld in some condition or other. And then on the first day of spring are reborn. So whether it's the Persephone myth or the Dumuzi myth or the Dionysus myth. There's many of these about a God who is dead and reborn. What is that conveying? That all of nature dies and is always reborn. And so in the ancient Near East, the holiday, all across ancient Near East, was always the first day of spring. And on the first day of spring, they acted out this story of the God who dies and is reborn. Of course, that has nothing to do with a religion that celebrates the death and resurrection of God on the first day of spring to this day. But, you know, we'll come back to that. Actually, you'll have to take the New Testament course to think about that. But as I've said, I only do BC. AD to me is like a big blur. It's like, Jesus, Columbus, Kennedy, Obama. You know, it's like, that's, you know. It's like the Midwest to me. You know, it's kind of a blur. They all begin with I, the states in the Midwest. And you tell an Englishman, I'm from Iowa. He says, oh, that's frightfully interesting. We pronounce it Ohio. You know? So you discover already in our first lecture that I've had this problem my entire career, that my digressions are better than my lectures. You know, I can't help it. So there are these. So a myth isn't just an any old story that you make up. It's something that reflects the realities of nature. And the most common kind of myth in the ancient Near East is a cosmogony, is the term for it, which we'll write here in the Mediterranean Sea. It's this Greek root is like it's the root of the word Genesis, or begin, or generate, and you know, to birth something. So it's a story of the birth of the cosmos, the creation of the cosmos. And the most famous one in the ancient Near East, it's called the Enuma Elish. It's, as far as we know, the oldest book we know of in the world. It's all in poetry. We know it was famous because we found copies of it in more than one language and in more than one place across the ancient Near East. Note that I say it's in poetry. I should digress on that for a moment. If you'd ask somebody, which did humans write first, prose or poetry? I'm betting that most people would guess prose. Wrong. Humans wrote poetry for thousands of years before they wrote prose. The first long prose writing known on Earth is the oldest portions of the Bible. Before that, people only wrote poetry. Now that's counterintuitive. You'd think people would just, you know, prose, just write it out first. But no, part of it we could say is because writing and implements of writing and all were rare and costly. And it could be a matter of memory. So for example, I could give you the entire Beatles songbook, right? I know every word of every Beatles song. And hundreds of other musical groups and songs. And every one of you knows the words to hundreds, maybe thousands of songs. But I couldn't memorize War and Peace, which is, you know, shorter than the number of words in all the songs I know. Music lends itself to memorization. So we'll start at our next class meeting. In the beginning, God. No, we won't do that. So in the Enuma Elish, that's in Akkadian, it's the opening two words. They always name books for the opening words of the book. So it means when on high. And it talks about when on high things hadn't been created yet. And it tells the story of creation. And creation, according to the Enuma Elish, began with a battle between the old gods, who are represented by water. Water wants to be left alone and just take the shape of its container. As opposed to the young gods, like the wind and the sun and all, who they're active and they move and they run around. The old gods hate that. So they decide they want to kill all the young gods. They do what any good parents would do. They want to kill their children for running around in class. And so there's a war between the young gods and the older gods, and the young gods choose the wind god as their champion, because I told you he becomes the chief executive god. So this is Enlil or Baal, depending on which language you get the myth. And he goes to battle against the sea goddess, who is the mother of these gods, and her name is Tiamat. That's an A. And she is the sea. She's also pictured as a dragon. She opens her mouth to devour him, but he takes his winds that are his main force, because he's the wind, and he casts them down her throat, which opens her up and distends her belly, as in pregnancy, symbolically. I'm sorry, did Freud live and die for nothing? I can't resist this stuff. And then he takes his bow, the rainbow, and his arrows, the lightning bolts, and he shoots them, pierces her heart, that kills his mother. This 3,000, 4,000 years before Freud, kills his mother, cuts her in half, and makes the sky out of half of her, and makes the earth and the seas below out of the other half of her. And that is why when you look up and you see the sky, you see blue up there. They thought that was water. That was the best known myth in the ancient Near East. And it too was performed every year on the first day of spring. Of course, there's no religions now that celebrate on the first day of spring an event where God splits water with wind. We'll come to that. Now, when did this happen? In what year did Enlil defeat Tiamat and create the world? Well, last year, and next year, and today, and tomorrow. Every year on the first day of spring. That is to say, and this is the hardest part to get about myth, is that mythic time is different from our sense of time. Our sense of time is historical. It's linear, right? When you took your first history lesson in second grade, third grade, whatever, how do they teach you history? The teacher goes up to the board and draws a line. That's time. And there's an arrow of time. It only goes that way. It never goes that way. And in the Western world, we put a mark on the line, and that's Jesus. And then going that way, well, time isn't going that way, but up to there. Here's Moses, here's King David, and up here, here's us. Here's, who do you want? Columbus. Columbus gets more than he deserves, really. Of course, I don't know about that because it's AD, so I'm just shooting the breeze with you. It goes all hand in hand that in pagan religion they were connected with nature and that they only wrote poetry, not history, because the world of nature and the world of poetry is not linear like that. It's cyclical. Nature is the change of the seasons in order, the moon going through its phases in order, the sun coming and going every day. Everything about nature is cyclical, and if you don't know that, don't go into farming. Whereas the Bible was the first attempt at history writing, seeing time as a line, where events affect the next events, and that is historical time, which is as different from mythical time as can be. And I admit to you that I don't really get mythical time. I understand it's recurring. I understand its eternal recurrence, that it's cyclical. But I grew up in the world that you all grew up in, which all of you, I never end a sentence with preposition, by the way. I know preposition is a word you don't end a sentence with. Come on, work with me here. You know this story about the Georgia girl who goes to Wellesley College, and she meets her roommate, and she's a snooty New England type. And she says, "Where are y'all from?" And the roommate says, "I'm from a place where we don't end our sentences in prepositions." And she says, "Oh, I'm sorry. Where are y'all from, bitch?" Some of my best friends went to Wellesley. I'm not... Possibly the next president went of the US, not of the university, went to Wellesley. So I I completely lost my point because of that thing about prepositions. But it was that I don't really get mythic time. It's hard to capture something up in which you didn't grow. And we'll do our best to get it. Now, these pagan gods, where are they? They're in the natural realm then. They're fellow members of the universe like you and I and a dog and a stone are. It's just there's a hierarchy of consciousness and power among these various members of the universe. And they're the highest. Now we come back to the original point then about idols and the way it's pictured in the Bible as idol worshiper. Idols are not gods in the ancient Near East. The sun is a god. The sea is a god or a goddess. The statues are not. We have a Babylonian text that says the idol is not the god. Is that clear enough for everybody? Now, you could say if some ancient Babylonian priest wrote the idol is not the god, it's because he had some dopes in his congregation who were treating the idol like it was God, and he needed to say, hey, the idol is not the god. God's over there. But so there were, there were dumb pagans and smart pagans like, all of us too. There's a hierarchy of that, I suppose. But they understood that. And you don't, an idol in the ancient Near East was a plastic Jesus on the dashboard. A person who keeps a plastic Jesus on the dashboard and doesn't care if it rains or freezes, you don't know that song, doesn't think that that is Jesus. When a Catholic walks into a Catholic church and sees an icon, a statue of Christ in the church, or a statue of Mary or the saints, they don't think that that's Jesus or Mary or the saints. They understand that it's just symbolic. It may still come to have special feeling for them. If your family has a particular statue of Mary that belongs to your great-great-grandmother and has always meant something in your family, so you have a special feeling for it, and you might kneel in front of it and pray or something, you don't think that it is Mary, but it provides a kind of closeness and a direction for prayer, and that's fine. That's what the idols are in the ancient Near East. But to a biblical ancient Israelite walking into a Canaanite temple and seeing them bowing down in front of a statue of Baal and saying, "Oh, mighty Baal," answer, they present the religion that way. But that isn't what it was, and you'll never get the origin of monotheism and what's going on in the Bible that was so revolutionary until you get that. So who's this God of Israel? If the thing, the Shamash, the Dagon, is the same as the name of God, then what can we say about God in the Bible? His name is Yahweh. This is where things get complicated. We usually write it like this with just the consonants, not the vowels. The invention of the alphabet was one of the great world-changing events of all time. In Akkadian and Sumerian, they had these ideograms. It's all these different combinations of triangles, and you have to learn thousands and thousands of them, and then you've got Babylonian Akkadian. And then after you've done all that, you start over and get thousands and thousands of different triangles to make the same sounds in Assyrian Akkadian. Mothers, don't let your children grow up to be Near Eastern scholars. I mean, it's serious. So when somebody invented something where you only needed 20-something symbols to make all the sounds you needed, this was an extraordinary thing. But it took a couple of stages to get it. So the crucial part of what makes Hebrew and the other Semitic language work is the vowels. They don't write vowels. They hadn't invented that yet. So only consonants are written in Hebrew. And by the way, it's done that way to this day. If you read an Israeli newspaper, it's like reading shorthand. There's only consonants, no vowels. So when you read the Bible, it's that way too. And that wouldn't matter so much, except in the biblical times, people pronounced God's name. But somewhere near the end of the biblical period, it became a practice among the Jews never to say God's name aloud. It was like the thing like, when you're a little kid and the first time you call your parents by their first name, "Hey, Henry," And sometimes some parents, the cruel parents, are okay with that. And some say, or they'll let you get away with it, but eventually you let it go because maybe you yourself are not comfortable with that. Well, multiply that by infinity, literally, and I know everybody now uses the word literally to mean figuratively. The football commentators, he was literally crushed. And you go, oh my God. So you wouldn't want to say God's name. It became a practice among Jews not to say God's name, and Christians followed that too. So when you look at English Bibles, whenever it has the word that's the name of God in the Hebrew, in English they put in the word Lord instead. And so that you'll know it's not the normal word for Lord, it's this that's written in the Hebrew. You'll notice if you look in your English Bibles, all 4 letters are capitalized. Whenever you see the word Lord written L-O-R-D, all in uppercase, it says this in the Hebrew. And if it's just capital L and then O-R-D, then it's the actual Hebrew word for Lord, which is the word Adonai. In Greek, they write Kyrie. You know, in English, we write Lord. And people in general say that because they don't want to say the name of God. Now, here's the thing. For all the times in the Bible where the prophets are hollering at the people, you're not good, you're not obeying God, you're worshiping other gods, the one commandment that the Jews got right and that all the Christians got right was they stopped saying God's name aloud. And since it's only written with consonants, nobody knows what the original vowels were. We forgot how to say God's name. And so when vowels were invented in the medieval European period, they took the vowels of Adonai and wrote them in here so that whenever you looked at this word, you would say, don't try to say that word, say Adonai, Lord. And then people misunderstood that, and they thought those were the correct letters, and from that you got the pronunciation Jehovah, which is just all wrong. Some of my best friends are Jehovah's Witnesses. It's not. We think the correct pronunciation is Yahweh. I hope I don't offend anyone among those of you who don't say the name aloud. My practice is to follow whatever people did in the period I'm studying. So in the biblical period, people said the name, so I do. In later periods, they didn't, so I don't. So we will find out who Yahweh is in our next meeting.